Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Sunoikisis's Digital Classics, Summer Term 2021. Today is our 10th session, and we have a session about annotating geographical data with Recogito. Our guests today are Elton Barker, Professor of Classics at the Open University, and Valeria Vitale, Research Associate at the Alan Turing Institute. They have been contributing a lot to Sunoikisis's Digital Classics, so today we are very happy to have them here for our session on annotations of geographical data. As usual, you have the class outline in GitHub with a full description of these session readings, further readings, and various resources and also exercises. But please, I think we can start. So Elton, welcome back to Sunoikisis.
It's a pleasure to be here. Let me just share my screen.
Yes.
Give me 1 second. And you should now be seeing my screen. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly.
Great, great. It's a pleasure to be here. Many thanks for the invitation. I'm particularly thrilled to be here with Valeria and not doing a workshop on Recogito, but actually getting into the nitty-gritty of its use. So to give you a little bit of background of how, or perhaps better, why we're using Recogito. So I'm interested in representations of space and place in antiquity, particularly in ancient Greek narrative. This is, I think, a particularly interesting question because so little spatial information comes to us through a cartographic medium from the ancient world, not only because of the accident of survival, but because so much spatial information was encoded in narrative. And that's particularly what I'm interested in, extracting spatial and placial information from non-modern narratives and how that can offer different ways of thinking about space and place. And the particular narrative that I'm working on in a minute, and this is a collaborative project that I will emphasize the people who I'm working with at the end of this presentation, is Periagesis' description of Greece, a particularly interesting narrative for thinking about the ways in which space and place are represented. It's a very rich, it's a very place-rich text, as you're going to discover in a minute. And at the same time, the emphasis is on description. So descriptions of place within the landscape, perhaps not so much the landscape itself. Again, something I might want to come back to. In any case, this is you have two images here. The first one in the top of the screen gives you a sense of the structure of Pasanus' narrative. His description of Greece is very focused on mainland Greece, as you see there. His narrative is split into 10 books, and you see there that in book 1, that's a focus on Attica and in particular Athens. Then he works his way around the Peloponnese, ending up in focus where really the focus is on Delphi. So that's the overarching structure of the narrative is based on this particular landmass. But as soon as you start getting into it, and this is very much influenced by Will Hutton's book, for example, and his analysis of the cognitive mapping within Pasanus, is you get a sense not so much of this bird's eye view, which of course we're so familiar with from our own technological and ideological framework, but the ground view, so moving through space as if you're on the ground. And that's so the second image is one of Will Hutton's handmade graphs, if you will, of how Pasanus is moving through the landscape. Long roads for sure, but also moving through particular spaces around monuments, etc. So it's this, I guess, tension between that bird's eye view and the ground view that I'm particularly interested in exploring. And by digitally mapping this information, you're going to see how we're doing that in a minute in Recogito. Of course, you are able to visualize the places mentioned in Pasanus on a map. That's kind of helpful for giving a sense of the spatial breadth and density of the place information. And if nothing else, this map here, which is a freebie that you get in Recogito, so there's no analytics here, but it's useful in terms of just a simple visualization tool, in the sense that immediately you get a sense of even though the 10 books of Pasanus are very focused on mainland Greece, he mentions pretty much the whole known world of the time. You really get a sense of the oikumene, particularly Greek communities elsewhere along the Greek mainland, on the islands, the Ionian coast, and there in Italy, the Italian peninsula and Sicily. So just by simply mapping the place information Pasanus, you already get a better sense of the spatial breadth and density. We're using Recogito to do this work, and I think two main reasons for using Recogito, in addition to the fact that it's just such an easy tool to use. First of all, we're interested in two aspects of annotating place information Pasanus. The first aspect is, of course, the identification of the place information to begin with. So here I'm giving you some work that I've done elsewhere, just mapping the catalogue of ships in Homer's Iliad, because it's quite a nice, simple, contained example to give you a sense of what a mapping in Recogito can afford. So there's the mapping itself of the place. So you as you know, in Recogito, you highlight the character string, you then map that across to a gazetteer entry, which enables you then to be able to see this place you've just annotated in the text on a map. Importantly, and this is a point I want to bring out here, it's going to be important in a second as we turn to Pasanus, is using tags to provide more information about that place. And this is where the Homer's catalogue of ships is quite useful, because it very quickly and easily give you a sense of how tags can be used. So all I've done, I mean, nothing's fancy here, all I've done in the tags in Recogito is to use Homer's own, if you like, description of the places he's talking about. So he doesn't only mention individual places in the catalogue of ships, he always assigns them to a particular catalogue. So the place you're looking at the minute, Aulis, from which the Greek ships, of course, launched, the expedition launched to Troy. Aulis is located as part of the Boeotian contingent. That's the language that Homer himself is using. So I've just simply tagged Aulis with the tag Boeotian contingent. And at a glance, then you get a sense not only of the individual places mapped in the catalogue of ships, but also by contingent. And that's really useful for bringing out the continuities of space as he moves around the Peloponnesus, but also some maybe discontinuities and how places are part of the same contingent, if not exactly topographically proximate to each other. So there's some interesting questions can emerge just from this very simple process. And this rather scary looking, or at least I think it's scary looking, Excel-like database there gives you basically, it's a snapshot of the information that you're providing through this process of annotation. So first of all, this is the ID that the Recogito will give you for each individual of your annotations. This is the file reference, so the individual stamp for the file you've uploaded. You've then got the quote in the Greek. Of course, it comes out as gobbledygook in Excel if you're not careful. Then the URI is the place URI that we're using to map to. So this is the Pleiades gazetteer that we're mapping the place across to. Then you've got vocab items coming to us from the gazetteer along with the coordinates. And here's the tag information. And I want to focus on the tag information in a second. But of course, the other important aspect for using Recogito, in addition to this ability to annotate and to use tags and it being really easy, is it's also semantic annotation. You're providing more information about the place by virtue of that second step process. So the first step of identifying the place, the second step of aligning that to this authority file, global authority file, a gazetteer. And it's that two-step process that enables you to produce linked data, this IDF. So this is what's good. So this even scarier looking code here, the pointy brackets, that's what's going on underneath the hood of Recogito. That's something I don't have to worry about. But the important thing for the digital Periagesis project is that in addition to, of course, for using Recogito and producing these annotations for our own benefit and for our own research questions, we want to leave behind these annotations for other people to use. So using Recogito, which enables us to publish those data in various different formats, I'll come back to that at the end of the presentation too. And in particular, as IDF means that we can produce linked data, the results of our annotations can be surface, can be discovered, and importantly, reused and mixed with, integrated with other resources. So it's those two aspects really. I think the ability to get really granular with the material, with using tags, and also this ability to produce data that can be reused, that other people can use. And this just gives you an example of the kind of thing you can do if you're all using the same gazetteer URIs and you're producing linked data. This is the Periagesis search tool that's also developed as part of the Plagios initiative, just as a demonstrator of the ways in which you can search through different kinds of data sets purely by virtue of the fact that they reference the same place. Now, there was a challenge for us, however, in using Recogito. And that challenge really relates to the point about using a gazetteer in the first place. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Pausanias, but those of you who are, those of you who aren't, will be, I think, really surprised about the granularity, the extent to which Pausanias gives you a deep dive into the various places of Greece. I've shown you that map before, those 10 rough regions which Pausanias devotes each book to. But within those regions, Pausanias more than just gives you information about a particular place settlement, which is the kind of thing that you'd normally get in a gazetteer like Pleiades. He gives you a deep dive into those place settlements, not only particular regions within the settlement. So if we're taking Athens as an example, for the Keramikos, the Acropolis, or the Agora, locations that, after all, you can probably find in Pleiades, although not to such an extent as you'd find just for their entry in Athens. But he gives you a lot of other information, temples, and down to really the granular level, to statues, to paintings, and other kinds of iconography. And that information just simply isn't there in Pleiades. It's because it has such a wide temporal and spatial scope. Pleiades is obviously focused on settlements to now, with some exceptions of some places within cities where the information allows it, such as in Pompeii, also in Athens. So in the top left here, you see the entry for Athens, and there are, I think, 15 to 20 places within Athens. Pausanias gives you hundreds to the thousand of places or objects in space, and that we were interested in getting down to that level. So we were presented with a problem, and if we wanted to use Recogito, we could only annotate a bare minimum of the place information that Pausanias was giving us. So, as always, when you're confronted with a problem like this in the digital world, you do a hack. So our hack consisted of drawing upon 3 other data sets that had valuable spatial information, but which aren't gazetteers. They are not designed as gazetteers. So there's 3 other data sets: a topos text. This is a database of ancient Greek and Roman texts that have been geolocated by Brady Kiesling, and essentially that Brady actually joined us as part of the Periagesis project. I think, with this background of topos text, so invaluable for him to bring that expertise to us. The other, towards the bottom left, is a page resource from the German archaeological database, the Arachne database, where they have a lot of information that has been identified as information related to what Pausanias is describing, largely statuary, but also other things like paintings. And then also Judith Binder's art historical database, which has been made available recently on Dipylon. So we used these 3 databases of other kinds of information that had important place information attached. So just to take one example, the German archaeological database has information about the kinds of objects that Pausanias is describing within space. And that's exactly the kind of thing that we were interested in annotating and mapping. So we are running our own version of Recogito, something you can quite easily do if you've got kind of some technical support. We're running that off the Umeå servers. This is a Swedish-run project. So this is that we're using the servers at Umeå University to run our instance of Recogito with these 3 other data sets uploaded as if they were gazetteers, and we are mapping to them as if they were gazetteers, just as we would as if we were mapping places to Pleiades. So let's see this in action, which is really kind of the meat of this presentation. So the next, I think, 2 to 3 slides are giving you a deep dive into our annotation process and kind of our thinking behind it, some of the issues that we had to confront, and also hopefully you'll get a better sense of what it is we're trying to do and why we might want to be doing it. So this is I've given you the Greek for that first paragraph, where Pasanus just throws you straight into his description without any kind of introduction whatsoever. Already an interesting, I think, tactic. The first place mentioned, so if you think of this as a character string, Ellinikes, I've identified as a place. So that's the first step, as you know, in Recogito. And then the second step is trying to align that to a gazetteer entry. And I've chosen Hellas as the most appropriate, if not perfect, the most appropriate gazetteer entry. Of course, and here I want just to flag up a caveat here, but it's also, I think, an opportunity presented by the technology. You have to make a decision with these annotations, and so I really want to emphasize how each annotation is also interpretation. And this first example is actually a great example of that, because I've made the assertion, the interpretation, what Pasanus is talking about here is Hellas. Of course, what he means by the Greek mainland is an open question, and in many ways, the 10 books that are to follow are an attempt of trying to describe that space, that Greek mainland. This is a very interesting thing beginning here, and what is meant by Greek. And later on, he talks not of a Greek space, but ta Hellenica, Greek things. As something to record, what that means for a kind of a Greek space, and how we should imagining that the area in which he's ascribing these spaces and objects is a very interesting question. So this is just to flag up how using a digital tool, you're confronted with the importance of making a decision, an interpretation, but by going through that very process, that's already helpful for trying to clarify your own thinking and how you are thinking about a particular place such as this. So let's take this as read, that this is Hellas. That's the first step. So you can see the other highlighted entities here in green, with the green highlight. These are all other places that we mentioned, including, and this is where it really gets to the importance of using something like Recogito, so not just a simple NER and named entity recognition, is the ambiguity, the flexibility with which Pasanus describes space. So limen, for example, not attaching a name to that harbor, you have to think about the context of what harbor he's talking about, or even a kind of better example, outer, just a pronoun standing for a place. Again, the human reader, a computer's not going to be able to understand that in this context as a place. It requires a human reader to make that assertion. So there's the first aspect, the identification of the place. But we can do more, and that's where the tags come in. And this is where I just want to give you a sense of the typology that we've developed. I mentioned before, this is a collaborative project. There are, I think, 6 or 7 of us working on it. Each one of us has their own book. Some of the braver have got 2 books. And we're all trying to annotate as far as possible in the same way, so that our data is robust and is extensible, and that claims made about one book stand up to scrutiny relating to another book. That happened through a process of trial and error, trying out different typologies, different ways of trying to categorize the places and spaces that Pasanus is talking about. And I just want to give you a sense of why it is that we've come up with this particular strategy. So our typology relies upon 3 kinds of ways of thinking about space. The first, you think, is a broad category of space. What kind of place is this? Is this part of the built environment? Is it part of the physical environment? Is it a mythical place, possibly? Is it something more conceptual, something regional? And I think you can see here that thinking of Greece, that's definitely more of a conceptual category, if nothing else. And the difficulty of trying to pin down what Greece might mean at this juncture in time. So this is a regional idea that has a very strong sense of a concept behind it, beyond and above and beyond geometric coordinates. So that's the first tag, and that's kind of, you think of that as the kind of the genus, the kind of the broad category. The second tag we've used to try to give a little bit more information about the place that he's describing. In this case, the mainland, the Greek mainland. Now we notice here that we've used the tag Epiros. This is because we've tried so far as possible to reuse the language that Pausanias uses. Just to give you one example of where this might make a difference, for a lot of the time he will talk about statues as a galma, so something maybe has a divine aspect, or Andreas, which seems to be more focused on humans. Sometimes he just doesn't mention the statues at all, in which case we would just use the English tag statue. So this is an attempt to try to keep our typology very much focused on the language that Pausanias himself is using, in a way to better get a handle on his own conceptual framework, in a way that he's trying to organize the spaces and places that he's describing. The third category requires a little bit of explanation, I think. So, and this is very much a kind of contextual category. So it depends on how the place is being seen. So at the beginning here, what we get a sense, so I'll just run you through that first line. So we're homing in from the Greek mainland, against the Cycladic Islands and the Aegean Sea. They're standing out. There's the Acra, there's a promontory of Sunion. And standing out from that is the Attic land. So in other words, what we get here is really zooming in from on high. This is like a bird's eye view, or perhaps better, thinking of an ancient Greek context, a muse-like or God's eye view of space. That's not the general category in which Pausanias' description is normally understood. Pausanias' description, as already implied by that sense of movement around the Greek mainland, and particularly that network graph that Will Hutton has produced, is much more of a ground's eye view. In fact, if we move to another place, this is on the second line, and we move to that Acra, the second mention of the Acra at Sunion, the promontory. At this point, we've moved into what you might call the conventional way of thinking about Pausanias' spatial description as hodologic, route-based, moving as if you're on the ground through these spaces. So here we have a sense, and you could think of this as from the perspective of like a cinematic metaphor. The camera zooms in from that big pan out at the beginning as you're approaching the Greek mainland and the islands and the Aegean Sea down to Sunion, homing in until we're there, actually moving through the space. And that's keyed in by this entity that I've marked in pink there, which is the addressee, the first mention that there's a narratee here. Not mentioned, it's a third person, quite typical of spatial description in ancient Greek to have that kind of third person mentioned. Becomes very important in Pausanias' narrative for locating that person, i.e. us, in this space. So through use of that third person, we are moving between two spatial planes, if you like, that we're trying to capture with that third tag, from the synoptic to the hodologic. We've used PAUS, standing for Pausanias, just because it was easier to use than hodologic. It just seemed, okay, what Pausanias is describing here is himself or his reader in this space, moving through it as if on a route. So that's what we understand as a third tag, Pausanias. And just to run through the other tags here regarding the Acra, this time it's a physical space, a promontory. So that's the reason for the first tag. And again, the second tag, trying to draw out from Pausanias' own description the language that he's using, with the anticipation that once this is all basically using the text as a database, once all that has been annotated, we will be able to run off a list of all acras or mainlands or mountains or rivers and get a better sense of where they occur in the narrative and the description attached to them, how they're described, what kind of role they're playing within the narrative. So this is, if you like, the granularity of moving through place. But I just wanted to leave you with one other slide before, again, maybe just taking a step back, branching out before handing over to Valeria to give you a very different use of Recogito, is that what I've discovered in particular is that Pausanias doesn't just move through space, he also moves through time. It's that sense of this is more than just, I mean, Pausanias has been described as rather misleadingly as a travel, as a kind of a guidebook. And where I think the complexity of Pausanias really comes to the fore, over and above his description of place and space, and I'm happy to talk about it in the questions, is the intersection between space and time. Now, time is more difficult to capture for various reasons. First of all, Recogito, or the community more generally, lacks the kind of robust global authorities, gazetteers, if you like, for time that we have for place. There's no equivalent of the Pleiades. There are some emerging, such as Periodo, that are becoming important. But the other important thing to mention here is these emerging time gazetteers are of themselves, of course, built on conceptions of time from different periods, particularly scholarly divisions. Periodo trying to do its best in mapping across different conceptions of the Bronze Age, for example. Whereas what really interests me is how Pausanias is describing time. So there's an issue here, a real important conceptual issue regarding how Pausanias talks about time. Now, many of the events, many of the people he talks about, we can find dates. They're either there in the Perseus text, and I should have mentioned that, of course, that we're using the Perseus text, a good example of reuse. Or you can find information on Wikidata, or Wikipedia, or scholarly journals on what, when he talks about a particular event or person, being able to attach a BCE time to it. But using this kind of modern temporal classification system for time is misleading in Pausanias' context. So can we try to extract from Pausanias a sense of time that is meaningful for his audience? So what I've tried to do, and here you see an example. So this is where we're moving from place. So he talks about the Laurian mines, and there's a deserted island called Patroclus. And why is it called Patroclus, the Patroclus Island? Well, there was a fortification built on it. So this guy here is explanatory. It's nice, a Thucydidean device, helping us better understand the naming, and naming is very important to Pausanias, the naming of places and spaces. What's behind that name? And history is behind that name. So we now shift from the movement of the traveler through time to moving with Pausanias, with agents through time. We move from moving through space with Pausanias, and the reader now moving through time with his historical agents, and this particular Patroclus, for example. And the way that I've tried to extract this information and use it with regard to Recogito is to use, again, tags, and to use a time tag just donated by T, and trying to think of a broad category that would make sense to a Pausanian reader. And something like this Macedonian War he's talking about could be an appropriate temporal marker. I mean, I think that's open for debate, but things like the Persian War, the Trojan War, are definite markers that I'm pretty confident that Pausanias' reader would be aware of. So maybe we can extend that also to this more recent Macedonian War, however we want to define that. But just to give you a sense that there's also time that you can mark here. How you mark it, I've chosen to use tags. Other people might want to use the event category as a different marker. I've tried to reserve that, as you can see, for narrate and other narratorial aspects. You might want to use the relational tagging feature of Pausanias, of Recogito. I think it really depends on you and how you find Recogito's annotation process working with respect to your aims. So just to finish, just the kind of, okay, that's really the nitty gritty. That's the kind of the hard, deep mapping work. That's very, and I think one thing I want to leave you with is, though we're using a digital tool, I'm not really talking about big data, although we are producing big data. The annotation we're producing run into the 40, 50,000. So there's big data there. But what I found most interesting, at least thus far, is what it really gets you to work much more closely with the text and think in a much more systematic way, in the way in which you're organizing the text and producing this kind of typology. Okay, but there's also data to be then analyzed. So the annotations, yes, are a product of analysis, but they're also the beginning of analysis. So how might we want to start exploring those data? Or indeed, other people might want to start exploring those data. Well, there's obviously GIS, since what we're producing is very geolocated. And so it'd be interesting to compare, for example, the mapping of statues to the mapping of paintings over the course of the narrative. Just give you a very simple example. Maybe we're using that relational tagging tool to relate places and people and time to each other, to events. So we might want to think of some kind of Gephi network visualization tool, or something like NodeGoat, for example. We might want to read text and map alongside each other. There's something like a Neatline Omeka application, or Leaflet more generally would allow. And then there's kind of Jupyter Notebook, so really getting into the nitty gritty of trying to use those pointy brackets in a way that would make in a much more analytical fashion than I'm certainly accustomed and will have to learn. So there's kind of I think it's important to think of not one tool that's going to do everything, but thinking of the appropriate tool for depending on what it is you want to do. And of course, the learning curve that's going to require, or at least some kind of collaborative effort to make best use of those tools. So really what I want to end on are kind of 2 points. First of all, that importance of close reading and the idea of annotation, every annotation as being an interpretation. That's one of the key lessons, I think, of working on the Periagesis project with Recogito. And the second point is about the linking aspect. I showed you a bit of the code before, but I think as important as the code are also the communities around this. I've mentioned this is a collaborative project. We all come into this with different skill sets, some more technical than others, and I'm very much at one end of that and not the other, not so technical. But also the data that we're producing, that idea of being able to link from Pausanias text to the archaeological information, the material culture, not to prove one right or wrong, but to really to bring these different resources into, let's go back to this side, for example, Pausanias' route through the Agora, not to prove that he was right in this description of the Agora, or to talk about the archaeology, but really to think about them in the round, to think of the material culture and the literary representation together, to get a better sense of the underlying tensions within the narrative, the underlying ideologies, the kind of the cultural framework of the narrative, that sense of an imaginary space that you move through as much as the kind of physical space. And I think that's particularly pertinent for thinking about landscape description. And of course, as soon as you start talking about community, want to start thinking about the Pelagios network. And just to give you one example of how the network has helped us here. So the Periagesis project was one of the founding partners of the Pelagios network. So we joined right at the beginning when the network transitioned from being a project to when Pelagios transitioned from being a project to becoming this open association of partners. So we joined in, wanting to have a seat at the table, try to influence conversations relating to kind of annotation procedure that we've been using in Recogito, and also various visualization applications. And to give you one concrete example of how that's worked for us, we've had some development money that we've used, and some of it we put aside for developing an aspect of Recogito that enabled users of Recogito to change the order of tags. That was really important because until then, the tags that you saw, once you'd made a decision that this was your order, that was your order. And if you wanted to then go back and change the order, you had to go back into each individual item, delete each individual tag, and then retag. Now, through a little bit of money from the Periagesis project that we put aside for development of Recogito, now not only can we change around the tags at will, but anybody can. So that's a feature that's now benefited the whole community, because of the fact that we're in this network and we're able to have these conversations with other like-minded groups, people interested in geo-annotation more generally or specifically kind of linked open data aspects, and a tool like Recogito. So these are some of the resources I've cited. And I look forward to the discussion. And I would like to pass over to Valeria now for something completely different, I'm sure.
Okay, Elton, thank you very much for this presentation. So I think that it was important because we had sessions before about Recogito, showing the tool, which is very user-friendly, but today we could see concrete problems concerning annotation. So annotations are an interpretation. And then also it was interesting to see how to combine the annotation of space and time, the backbones of history, chronology and geography. And today, really, we had concrete examples of the difficulties of these annotations. But now we can move, before asking you questions, we would like to move to the second part of this session with Valeria Vitale. So again, using Recogito, we can see the annotation of secondary sources. So Valeria, please, I can,
yes.
Okay, here,
Thank you, Monica.
Your screen.
And, we're already on, wow.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Thank you, Monica. I just, before starting, I just wanted to say briefly that, as Elton anticipated, we're not giving a tutorial this time about Recogito, but if you want to, try and use Recogito yourself, we really invite you to do so. It's a very user-friendly tool. You can just, dive in and try to see if you can, make out how to use the interface, or you can use the tutorial that is linked in the GitHub page, or you can also watch one of the previous Sunoikisis sessions about Recogito and semantic annotation. We have linked one of the recent ones, but if you get really passionate about Recogito and you want to watch more, you will find probably a session about Recogito pretty much every year of the Sunoikisis program. And yeah, that was a little bit of introduction, and now I'm gonna start the second part of this seminar. And I would like to, as first thing, say thank you to Elton for this very fascinating journey through Pausanias journey, and for showing us how Recogito can be really used as an analytical close reading tool, almost a magnifying lens to look at primary sources and trying to extract different kind of information. So what we're going to do in this second half is something slightly different, which is using Recogito to look at secondary sources instead. And I think that this kind of process that is technically very similar to annotating primary sources, but can be methodologically different and can let's say bring up different kind of questions, and I think in particular can help us highlighting the various layers of interpretations that we can find when looking at the classical word. We can see them already in Pausanias, and even more in the later descriptions. And I think it also helps us it reminds us that the past is not something that is, self-evident, and it is not so in primary sources, but it's not so, not even, in descriptions of material artifacts. They are not, they're definitely not objective. And to make this point, I will go through two small case studies that are very much at the potential level. They're not fully fledged project like the Pausanias project that Elton just described. And they both are about ancient cities. And I will start with the city of Pompeii, and I was supposed to show you this beautiful slide before to talk about secondary sources. So I will start with Pompeii, and we will look at Pompeii through textual sources. And then we will move to the city of Palmyra. And for Palmyra, we will look at the annotation of images. That is another feature of Recogito. And again, we won't show you how to make the annotations, but feel free to check our tutorial and the other resources. So let's go to Pompeii. And Monica asked me to not give any knowledge for granted. So for those of you who don't know it, Pompeii was a Roman town that was located in the south of Italy, not far from Naples, and was destroyed around year 79 CE by the activity of the Vesuvius, the Vesuvius volcano. And although the location of Pompeii actually seems to have been well known in medieval times and also Renaissance times already, excavations of the site didn't start until the 18th century. And that was because actually there were some engineering works that happened to pass through Pompeii, and that was and that started the whole thing. The excavation process proceeded. It was, on and off for a very long period of time. Then it stopped for a few decades, and it has very, very recently resumed. There are new excavations going on right now. So Pompeii was a sensation when it was discovered, and it quickly became a must-see during the Grand Tour. And it was also the very first archaeological site that was open to the paying public. So it is not a surprise that along with the kind of, let's say, expert publications that we would expect, like, for example, epigraphers going there to copy the epigraphies, or antiquarians, or ancient historians, or even artists that were, of course, attracted by the statuary and the frescoes. There was also a blooming of publications that was targeting the general public, and in particular, of course, travel guides, and but also works of fiction that were set in Pompeii. And if you go to any of the large repositories of books out of copyright, like, for example, archive.org or Gutenberg, you will find a plethora of text about Pompeii, mostly, again, things related to visiting actually the archaeological site. And that is a great opportunity for us because Pompeii has been such a popular destination for a long period of time, and it was popular for people coming from different places, and that gives us a very precious and uncommon opportunity for comparison. But so what are some of the things that we could do with these secondary sources using Recogito? Well, the first thing would be obviously to download one or more of these texts. Let's start with one, and to clean up the text itself, which is going to take up the majority of your time. But when it's clean and ready, you can upload it in your Recogito account. And I'm going to exit my presentation and actually go to my Recogito page. Let's use this example. That is a book that is called Pompeii Illustrated with Picturesque Views by T.L. Donaldson. This travel guide was published in 1827. And one thing that we could do, a very straightforward thing that we could do, is start annotating place references in Pompeii, and in particular references to these specific buildings. And this would already be quite an adventurous task, because I can tell you that place names for buildings in Pompeii have had, quite a let's say, quite a fragmented history. So place names have changed quite a lot through time. So, for example, if we wanted to annotate a mention of a place like this forum nundinarium, and this is, by the way, how you create an annotation in Recogito, and we click on place. So in an ideal world, Recogito would immediately recognize the place that we're talking about and suggest a match to a gazetteer, which are those external authorities that Elton was mentioning. But because places have changed names so many times in Pompeii, it is very likely that we meet this kind of problem that Recogito actually doesn't find a match, because maybe this particular instance of how the place was mentioned is not very common, and it has not been already added to the Periagesis gazetteer. And this is also an opportunity for me to show you what to do when the place that you're trying to annotate in Recogito is not there. Some of the things that you can do. So you could click on search and actually try with another name, a name that is maybe more common. But how do we find out what is a more common place for a more common name for this place? Well, the best approach would be to use the biggest authority on the matter, which is a book written by Van der Poel on Pompeian toponymy. And of course, if you consult the index in that book, you will find pretty much all mentions that were ever published about places in Pompeii. But now we cannot go to the library, so what are we going to do? Well, there is a shortcut that we can take. That is just try and Google it. And just for the purpose of this example, I will use actually this. Donaldson says the Forum Nundinarium, otherwise called the Soldiers' Quarter. So let's Google the Soldiers' Quarter and see. And see what we can find. And you can notice that Google seems to have recognized that we're talking about a place in Pompeii, even though the name is uncommon. And it has already kind of understood what is the place that we're talking about. And you may also notice that all the pictures look quite old, and that it's likely to be because that name has not been used very much after the 19th century. So let's check some of the sources that we can find that might have other names for that place in Pompeii, for that building in Pompeii. And I'm going to choose this resource because I really like it. It's called Pompeii Picture, and it started as a crowdsourced platform to collect pictures of buildings in Pompeii, and then it grew also including other kind of secondary sources like postcards and holiday souvenirs, and it has become through the years a very valuable resource. So here we can see that they have listed a few variant names for the same place, and we could try each of them to see if they come up in Periagesis, but I will spare you the attempts, and I will tell you that Quadriporticus of the theater is the one that will definitely show up in Periagesis. So I didn't do this with soldier quarters because Recogito learns after you create an annotation, so I had already taught it that the soldier's quarter is actually the Quadriporticus of the theater. So instead of Forum Nundinarium, we try this while we are logged in. I'm not logged in, sorry. Okay. And now we can find it. And there we can confidently create this annotation because we have verified that actually the Quadriporticus of the theater and the Forum Nundinarium are indeed the same place. And if we look, this is the the entry in Periagesis for that building, and you can see that there are a lot of variant names, but actually Forum Nundinarium is not one of them. Okay, so now that you have hopefully enjoyed a little bit of ancient investigation, which it's obviously interesting in its own right, and it's something that I particularly enjoy. But what else can we do with the annotation when we have, let's say, learned how to deal with the possible gaps and the problems posed by the variant names? Well, one thing that we can do is actually using Recogito to compare these travel guides that were produced at different points in times. Because well, what travel guides do, it's basically suggesting to the travelers how to move through the space, so how to move through the archaeological site. And one thing that we could use Recogito for is to visualize how these itineraries through the archaeological site have changed through time. And just to give you a little bit more information about this, I'm going to show you another version of the same document to which I have performed a bit more annotations. It's not complete, but I wanted to show you how it looks like. And I want to show you one of my favorite things about Recogito, which is the very, very close relationship that it builds between the text and the space, which becomes, I think, especially poignant when we're looking at cities and, the where the point falls becomes really, really relevant to us. I'm also going to change the color here so that it contrasts better with greenery in Pompeii. So you see that through this visualization of some of the annotations that I have performed on the book, we can already get some insights on what were the places that were recommended to visit, and also how many mentions they received. And if we click on them, we can actually look at the different mentions, which is that relationship with the text and space that I was talking about. But the interesting bit in this case would be, as I was saying, the comparative dimension, because well, we could use this comparison to look at how, let's say, the practice of visiting Pompeii has changed through time. But before we do that, we need to consider some constraints, because if we just look at the text, that might give us a little bit of a partial idea or a biased idea, and there are some things that we should consider that are related to the history of the archaeological site itself. And first of all, we could, for example, look at where the entrance points were located. It is safe to assume that those were some sort of mandatory entry points. So it is likely that many of those itineraries had actually to start at the same place. But also how the excavations developed, because of course no one can visit a building that has not been excavated yet. And we can see, looking at the maps, this is a fairly early map of the excavations in Pompeii from the beginning of the 19th century. And you can see that there were actually very few buildings that are available. So you see the amphitheater, you can't see my cursor, but you can see the amphitheater on the right, and then the theaters area, and then the other portion. But already after 30 or 40 years, the situation is it's very different. You see the orientation here has now changed. We have the amphitheater on the top left, but you can see how many more places become available to the tourist. And you see that the forum has been now excavated, and other important buildings, like popular buildings like the House of Panza and so on. And we see the progression of the excavations. This is the beginning of the 20th century, and this very quickly, it's one of the latest maps of Pompeii from the beginning of the 21st century, which again is not complete anymore, because there are further excavations going on. When we look at what is available to the tourist at different points in time, then we can also start to make meaningful comparisons. And for example, to wonder if the discovery of new buildings made the older buildings lose their status of landmark, and what were the buildings that were considered an absolute must-see, and how that changed through time, and how much freedom also had people to move around the space, and how much they were very much confined to the major roads and to very, very let's say formulaic kind of visits. And I think that this kind of comparison could be quite interesting. I'm very early stage for this, and we could this kind of analysis could be performed in at least a couple of ways. And one would be to annotate each single document separately and then download the annotations in a CSV format, like we saw at the beginning, and then import the separate CSVs in a Google map or a GIS platform, and then create a separate layer for each text, for each book. Or we could use a comparative feature in Recogito that enables us actually to upload different documents at the same time, and then perform the annotations together, and then visualize them both as a unicum, but also separate by provenance. And if you're interested in knowing more about this kind of annotation, again, I really invite you to check out our previous tutorials. And to give you just a quick example of how that works, but also to give you an idea of what other kind of comparisons we can do with secondary sources, I'm going to go back to my Recogito account. And instead of talking of possible diachronic comparisons, so how let's say the visiting experience evolved through time, another thing that we could do is actually to choose a particular building in Pompeii and look at how it was described or mentioned in different publications that were produced by authors from a different nationality or with a different background. And so, for example, we could look at the Temple of Isis in Pompeii, which is a building I am particularly fond of, and you can change your base maps in Pompeii to choose the one that are most suitable to your project. So if you're working with ancient places, you may want to use the ancient place tiles, but for cities, I really like to use the satellite view that really shows where is the building that we're talking about. And in this way, you can use Recogito to compare the different views that have been produced about the same place. And here is the document view. So you see that I've cheated here. I didn't have the time to produce text formats for all of them, but I have just screenshotted the PDF. So these are all different books created by different authors, sometimes of different nationalities, all talking about the Temple of Isis. And you can really use Recogito to compare these different interpretations, these different readings of the place, and maybe discover that, that they differ from one another, and that, for example, that place has a strong connotation in one culture but not in other. And speaking in particular about the Temple of Isis, that in books produced by British writers, it tends to have a very strong connotation of deception and trickery and darkness, a connotation that seems to be completely absent, for example, in French writers. And which is quite interesting, because in the end they are, both looking at the same physical space. So this was a little bit of, an overview, a couple of examples of ways in which you can use Recogito to analyze and compare and come up with spatial-related questions when looking at secondary sources. Now, I have to close this session on Pompeii with the bad news. And the bad news that also Elton has already a little bit foreshadowed is that our annotations are as good as the gazetteers that we can exploit. So Pompeii is a bit of an exception, because it has a relatively good coverage in Periagesis. It's not complete, but especially if you're working on very early sources, you tend to find most of the buildings that you want to annotate, but it's definitely not the rule. That is definitely not the average granularity of historical gazetteers, or, to be honest, of gazetteers in general. So if this is, a bit of a bad news, let's say the bright side of it could be that Recogito could be used actually as an intermediate step in the creation or in the enrichment of an existing gazetteer, because it would be relatively easy to, again, use Recogito to extract references to particular places, either buildings or, even more granularly, and export those references systematically through the CSV, and then, again, find a way to make that CSV a sort of bulk entry for a gazetteer like Periagesis or other kind of resources. And now we move in our journey from Pompeii to Syria. And I'm very happy to talk about this other case study briefly for at least two reasons, and let's say three. One is that it was our first experiment with the crowdsourcing capabilities of Recogito. The second reason why I like it very much is that because it was a very collaborative initiative that was really born from the joint interest and let's say expertise of a great group of people, and it developed around a series of manuscripts, collections of manuscripts that are in the Library of the Roman and Hellenic Society, and they are the manuscript of the accounts of the travel of Robert Wood to the Levant. And the collaboration involved the head librarian of the Institute of Classical Studies, Joanne Ash, Jane Baird at Birkbeck University, Gabriel Bodard and myself as researchers at the Institute of Classical Studies, and Zina Kamash at Royal Holloway University. Here in the picture you can see how the original artifacts look like. And the other reason why I wanted to use this case study is because we will look at image annotation. So to give you an idea of another kind of flavor of Recogito annotations. So just very briefly about this travel, Robert Wood left with a couple of wealthy young Oxford scholars. Only one made it actually back, and they also were accompanied by an Italian draftsman that was Giovanni Battista Borra. Their goal was to visit Homeric places, but while they were at it, they also recorded and measured a lot of ancient buildings, and then they published those measurements and those drawings, and they became incredibly influential in European architecture and in the whole movement of neoclassicism. And by the way, if you are interested in knowing more about Robert Wood and about the manuscript in the ICS, I strongly invite you to check out another Sunoikisis seminar that was given by Jane Baird and Gabriel Baudard. It is linked in the GitHub page. And I also have to say that, I knew nothing about Palmyra. I still know very little, but I really knew nothing before, meeting experts like Professor Jane Baird and Zina Kamash. And this is really, me repeating their work and using their words. So although these, the manuscripts that were produced during this travel can be considered very, very precious historical documents, they are also, as you can imagine, and as Jen and Zina pointed out eloquently, very problematic, because they really express a quite obnoxious colonial perspective. And pretty much everything that is wrong and problematic with these sources, I think, is summarized in this painting that, again, was used by my colleagues in their presentation. And in this painting, you can see Wood and his associate looking, like a classical man that are almost discovering the city of Palmyra, and pretty much everyone else is in a sort of servile position, and with Bora being something in the middle. So when thinking of interesting things to do with the digitized version of these manuscripts, we had an idea. We decided to make some of the pages available on Recogito, and we had, I think, mainly three research questions. And one was, would the availability of these digitized pages on an interactive platform, and would the opportunity of creating annotations and saying something about these documents, would that alone create and generate engagement for people who were not, initially interested in it? The second research question was, what would they find interesting? What would they want to annotate? And the third research question I'll talk about later, because it's a little bit more complex. So what we did was creating a small event, a small in-person event, where we invited people to come and annotate the document freely. But we also made the document available to anyone with the link, and we disseminated it through social media. And that is to say that this is something that you can do. You can produce an open link to Recogito and enable anyone to annotate it. And well, about the first research question, we found that yes, this opportunity did generate engagement in people. They were interested, they were curious, they wanted to use Recogito, they wanted to look at the pages, they want to look for something they were interested in. And although, of course, we did this small event in the ICS, so in the Institute of Classical Studies. So, of course, we assumed that the people who came had an interest in the classical world, but they were by no means experts on Palmyra, and they probably would have, never browsed the manuscript, if not for this occasion. And about what people were interested in, I think that was possibly for me the most rewarding finding, because, well, they were interested in everything. So some people annotated the place mentioned, some people annotated the drawings, some people annotated the measurements, some people looked at the material features of the parchment, some people looked at the material traces of the digitization process, someone annotated mentions of spices. It was really rich and diverse, and I think it was a good reminder of what we said also before, that there is never a single way of annotating a document. It's always a richness of perspective. It always depends on what you're looking at, what are your interests, what are your research questions, if we're talking about an academic engagement. And well, if you ask me, were those annotations accurate? Were those annotations useful? Were those annotations reusable in an academic way? I would say, well, probably no. But that wasn't our goal. We were not asking people to participate in an academic project like a transcription project in which we wanted people to be really accurate. That wasn't the goal of this experiment. The goal of this experiment was really to see, does interacting with the document make people interested in it? And the answer was definitely yes. And all the annotations that were created, thanks to Recogito capabilities, can also be downloaded, can be preserved, and can be analyzed, so that scholars interested can see what a non-expert audience would look at when looking at a secondary sources describing ancient cities. And now to the third research question, that again is really not my area of expertise, but that of my colleagues, Jen Baird and Zina Kamash, and is we asked ourselves, can we use a medium like Recogito, a tool like Recogito, to give people that have a personal connection with Syria and with Syrian heritage to use annotation to challenge those colonial narratives that emerge so apparently in wood accounts, and can use Recogito to give them a different opportunity to tell their stories about that heritage, about what they think is relevant about that heritage, instead of having to listen of what a very entitled foreigner thought that was important about that heritage. And can we even use those accounts of an historical travel from the UK to Syria to talk about other kinds of travels, maybe in other directions, so travels that may be intersected with those of wood, but that tell very, very different stories. And this is, of course, I think, a very fascinating research area that requires a lot of work, a lot of effort, and a lot of time to establish relationships with the community and establish trust with the community. And again, this wouldn't be personally my work, but I would be really, really delighted to see Recogito being used in this respect. And I look forward to be contacted by research groups to take that forward. And I think that was the end for me. Thank you very much.
Okay, excellent, Valeria. Thank you very much for this second part of this session, which was very, very rich. So today we could see this fascinating journey from the annotation of ancient scholars like Pasanus, and then modern scholars, and also the annotation of objects, starting, well, at the beginning we could see raw text, and then now printed editions, manuscripts, images, so really a wide variety. But I think we can start with our discussion. And I see that, okay, we have today in the chat many comments, and also about Peripleo. And so let me see, we can start, I think, with this note by Gabriel Bodar.
I'm afraid Valeria answered that question 5 minutes after I asked it. So
yes, exactly. So And also another thing about bad news for the gazetteers. Well, promising news, because yes, of course, we still miss a lot of data, but this is the good thing. There is a lot of work for young, especially for young scholars and for future generations. So let's say good news, okay? Even if sometimes it's frustrating to look for data, etc. Gabby, yes, please.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? How well do we think we're doing if we assume that part of the workflow of any project that uses Recogito, Peripleo, the plagiate recommendations, various gazetteers, every project will find shortcomings, will find bits of the ancient world that haven't been included in the gazetteers, and will therefore contribute to them. How well do you think we're doing at getting projects to contribute all the places in Pompeii that are not yet in Pleiades, all the little monuments in Pausanias that are not yet in Pleiades or some other gazetteer? How's that going?
Shall I start? Well, it's not going maybe as well as we would hope in some respects, and relatively well in other. So there are projects like Pleiades that I really like. I'm really involved with it. I think it's an amazing project. I have a Pleiades sticker on my laptop. So this is not meant as a criticism, but they are a little bit slower to accept new contributions, and maybe more to the point. Maybe there isn't a very yet and a very easy and straightforward way for people to contribute bulk data. So contribute an entire spreadsheet. I'm sure that contributing one or two places is of course perfectly fine, and I strongly invite everyone to do so. But maybe coming up with a spreadsheet with 3,000 names, or even just 300, that is not is still not there isn't a very clear workflow for that, as far as I know. If I'm wrong, please, Tom Elliott, correct me.
I was actually. Oh.
No,
I thought you'd stop.
I wanted to close with the good news, which is that another thing that is happening is that people have started maybe creating small specialist gazetteers, and those are maybe contributed or can be contributed to the World Historical Gazetteer, and that is another option to to take forward the work that you're doing, extracting names from a text. And now you go, Elton, sorry.
Well, yeah, you've basically said everything I was going to say. I mean, particularly the point about there not being a workflow, or formalized workflow from people working in Recogito, and either using other databases as if they were gazetteers, like we're doing in the Periagesis project, or else just yellow flagging. So when you put a yellow flag in Recogito, it means you can't find an appropriate gazetteer match. And it would be quite nice at some point to be able to do some kind of, as Valeria was suggesting, some kind of bulk interaction between Recogito and Pleiades. Although I can also see issues relating to that too. Again, it's to do with quality control, editorial oversight. So I think the important thing here, again, there are always going to be technical, I think, solutions. So we can, I'm sure we can find a way of getting a bulk download that's going to be more appropriate for Tom and Pleiades. But it always comes down to people and relationships between groups, and to communicate better and to keep people in the loop. So although we are producing data as a Periagesis project, I think could be really helpful for Tom at Pleiades, we will have to do a better job at putting him in the picture, I guess, of where things are at. And perhaps, as Valeria said, the World Historical Gazetteer is a nice kind of bridge point between these smaller projects who are working on particular enriched areas, and something like Pleiades, which is has got such a wide scope, both temporally and spatially. I know, if I may, Gabby, I just noticed in the chat about peripleo, the two things to note about, because apparently it's not working in a minute. That's probably because they've done an update to the Austrian Institute of Technology where Rainer is, and he'll have to press a button to turn it back on. I mean, it's that high tech. But the serious point is that peripleo was only ever a prototype that we built in 2017. So we're not sustaining it. Actually, there's a third thing. But Rainer and I and some others are thinking about redeveloping specific instances of peripleo as kind of, again, with that kind of prototype idea of showing the kinds of things you can do once different data sets are connected. But, you know, peripleo as it is only ever going to be something to look at. It's not going to be anything more than that. And to look at it, Rainer will need to press a button. Sorry.
Okay, so we have a discussion in the chat. In the meantime, so I have a question about places. At the beginning, Elton, you showed different categories for places in Recogito and also tags. Of course, what we mean by places, this is an open question. We are learning that still today, because when annotating these texts, we learn and we can't have a definitive answer. But how do you think, so can we document what we are doing? So with this tool, we can annotate, we have the Greek text, we can work with translations, then we have unique identifiers, geolocations, etc., the map. But how can we imagine a form of documentation in this workflow? Of course, we can write a paper describing our work. How can we be consistent? What do you think about that for the documentation, which is in any case important, especially for tags, because of course we can add any tag we want.
A couple of things. Oh, great question, Monica. A couple of things. So first of all, the issue about place, you're absolutely right. You know, defining place has been a critical issue for us. And not only because we were interested in identifying as many things as Pasanus was talking about, but it becomes a real issue. So our definition of place is very, very broad, and that really relates to the way Pasanus is describing space. So we go from as broad a concept as Asia, whatever Asia is, or Greece, as I've hopefully shown. You know, that's definitely something I think Pasanus is wanting his reader to think very hard about. So we go from that very broad conceptual level to something a little bit more definable, maybe Attica, although there are border issues as well with, you know, Boeotia and Megara, so that's also a bit fuzzy. Of course, a place like Athens, but, you know, what point in Athens? You know, think Athens is a living organism. It's going to grow. It's going to, you know, decline. So what points? That's where the time-space issue comes in. But of course, what we're doing is we're going right down to the granular level. So for us, a statue is a place, or a painting is a place, a rock is a place. So, you know, and that's again a part in response to the deep dive that Pasanus is representing through his spatial pathway through Greece and kind of Greek imaginary. So that's one aspect. As regards to documentation, that's also very important. Part of that is publishing, as you say, although I have to say that most publishing venues are not so keen, I think, on typologies. You know, they want to see argument, naturally, of course. You know, what new thing have you shown? So not so much of an emphasis on methodology, although actually I think methodology is kind of an important thing. There's a programming historian, which I think we ought to look at as a good publication venue for exactly this kind of thing. Otherwise, we have a Google Doc, and it's a Google Doc that is open, and we are constantly fiddling with it. I noticed one of my tabs actually open is new annotation instructions I need to look at. So people have been fiddling and want to make a recommendation. I'm going to have to look at to see, and again see if I find that appropriate for what I want to do. So I think that it's a very important aspect is to think about documentation, think of different venues in which it might be appropriate.
Okay, thank you, really, thank you very much. I think that the first thing you said is very, very important, starting with broad categories, because this is the risk for us humanists. As an expert of Pasanus, for example, the temptation is to go down into the text. I want to annotate everything, but that's the problem. And then, so we have to generalize, to start with broad categories and then jump into the text. And in the end, it's a never-ending creative process, because we learn, we see that exactly a statue is a place, and then we can find many other possible places, okay, for our annotations. And thank you also for the part about, yes, the documentation, which is again something that we are learning to produce with our annotations. Okay, so I see that there are other comments in the chat. So for those of you who are on YouTube, you can see the comments in our chat.
Sadly, none of them are questions. Yeah.
Okay, yes, no, we don't have questions. But
yeah, I also want to clarify that I was in no way suggesting that people, should contribute, ancient places to, any other place that is not Pleiades. I was talking about, specialist gazetteer for, outside the scope of Pleiades, which are a frequent feature for people that use Recogito, maybe not so relevant for the digital classicists, but it is one of the, we work with people, we at Pelagios work with people that deal with different time periods. So.
And then another thing, so Valeria, you said that you were showing images of a guide. It was about not Pompeii, but Palmyra, I think. You said, okay, you didn't have the time to produce the text, but that's it. So we want to annotate also images of printed editions. This is another interesting part. Okay, of course, you showed images of basically manuscripts and other images, but that's it. So we can get to the text, and then there we have other problems for OCR in printed editions and get correct text to be annotated in Recogito. But then also we can do that. We can upload images of printed books, still preserving also the layout, which is something that today we know, we take for granted, but maybe in the future will be a technology that we don't know anymore. So it was interesting, I think, that example. Other possible comments? Well, maybe we still have 2 minutes, no, 3 minutes. Maybe can you say a few words about the exercises? Because I see that you added exercises in the class outline.
There is also another question in the chat.
Oh, sorry, okay. Yes, this one, okay.
Yeah, I'm not absolutely positive. I'm not actually certain what you mean, but I guess if you're talking about maps, the maps will come from elsewhere. So the maps in Recogito, Valeria, that would be the digital atlas of the Roman Empire, or from the Ancient World Mapping Center. What would it?
I'm not sure that any of the maps that we use are vectorized.
That's what was confusing me.
I know that Johan was working on the vector version of the ancient tiles, but I'm not entirely sure that's what we're using. I don't think so, but I might be wrong. Rainer would be the right person to ask.
I mean, again, I think that in any case, that question points to the importance of community and the importance of sharing resources. I mean, as I didn't make clear until about halfway through, the text we're using is from Perseus. We want to be good citizens. We want to take what's there and enrich it and give it back as best we can. And that also speaks to the point about Pleiades too. So we definitely want to, we have a ton of stuff we want to give Tom. The question is, how best can we do that? What kinds of pipelines can we think of that would not create any more headaches for Tom and take some of the burden on doing this, from an individual. So it's digital, but the human aspect is absolutely important here regarding the kind of sharing of resources.
I suspect the question was referring to the map, which I think was the Recogito visualization that you showed, Elton, which was titled "A Digital Periagesis Map in Greece," which looks like a vectorized map because it has the regions, places, and so forth superimposed over the map tiles.
Right.
And the question was, did Recogito create this, and how much of that did you have to construct?
Okay. Thank you, Gabby. I think you're absolutely right. So it's created within Recogito. The map tiles themselves are coming from elsewhere. I think, yeah, again, I think that's probably from the digital atlas of the Roman Empire. But yeah, the map that you saw there was created within Recogito. We didn't have to do anything apart from do the annotations and then go to the map screen. And what's useful about that map, I mean, you get this for free in Recogito, so there's not much analytical power. But what is useful is that you can see a breakdown of various aspects. One of which is breakdown of places by book, so you can see which places are mentioned within what book, things like that.
And the coordinates of the vectorized areas that you had in there are from the individual gazetteers.
That's right. Again, our information is only as good as the gazetteer information. So there's that, again, that importance of the kind of community circle there.
Yeah, I think that it was about the polygons basically that were showing. They come from the gazetteer. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you. Well, our time is over. Anyway, we have exercises also in the class outline, but I think they are quite self-explanatory, so we don't really have to comment them. So thank you very much for this rich session. It was great to see concrete problems. And again, as Elton and Valeria mentioned, you also have other sessions, many sessions about Recogito in Sunoikisis. And in any case, you also have guidelines. So please start annotating because we need data. Okay, now next week we have another session. We move to another topic, which is citation for historical text, and we have next week Matteo Romanello with a session about the Cited Loci project, connected to a second session about the Digital Latin Library in 2 weeks with Sam Husky. But as for today, so really, thank you very much, Elton and Valeria. It was great. And I wish a nice good night, good morning, everything, wherever you are, because we have a community in the world. And so see you next week. Okay, ciao, bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.